Let's begin by talking about how this project started.
Several years ago, Ruth and I began to discuss the idea of piloting a course and a textbook that would bring the field of comparative education to life for teachers, first at OISE and then hopefully to a much larger audience. Our idea was to develop a set of resources that would include chapters from some of the leading comparative education scholars working here at OISE, and to match that with some multimedia resources, films, online resources, that could really engage teacher education students in the field of comparative education. We developed a set of themes that could bring together the best thinkers on those themes to the teachers themselves, and themes that also seem to have a practical application to teachers. And thus we have some chapters on conflict, citizenship, sociology of schooling, the philosophy of education in comparative perspective, testing, international testing. What else do we have, Ruth? School improvement, and alternative forms of primary education, and pedagogy. So all of these themes have a kind of practical component, but at the same time are embedded in some of the very major questions that have driven the field of comparative education over the last 100 years, I would say. Yeah. And one of those themes is the idea that other schools and ours, that we can learn a lot from schooling elsewhere, educational systems elsewhere, and that can help us help inform our own school systems and our own practice as educators.
So we called the first chapter, Why Study Comparative Education? And I had the task of kind of laying it out and reflecting on how could we make these rich resources, they're available in libraries, online, in many different sources, accessible to teachers. And so I thought about structuring a chapter that would let them understand how the field had developed. The fact that it's one of the oldest fields in education, with an institutional history going back more than 100 years to Teachers College, Columbia in the late 19th century. And so I laid it out sort of historically, beginning with the early history, noting that in many civilizations, in European civilization, in Asian civilization, in the relations between China, Japan, Korea in ancient times, and also between Europe and Asia. I guess the most fabled would be Marco Polo, but there were many communications about education across societies. There was a lot of learning, although there wasn't a field that one would call comparative education. So the first part deals with the early history. Then we go into the 19th century and look at, actually a little before the 19th century, the figure who's considered the founder, Julian of Paris. A very interesting, rather revolutionary figure who had a lot of new ideas, traveled around Europe, and when he was kind of pushed out of the French bureaucracy, he used his time to learn about education in other societies and had the idea of setting up an institute at a very early point. Karen, you might want to talk about the 19th century, which is kind of interesting in terms of state schooling systems and learning from other states.
In the 19th century, of course, the idea of the modern idea of the school spread very rapidly in Europe. One of the earliest and pioneering countries that had a mass system of education was Prussia, and here the Prussian state wished to produce a commonly educated, loyal citizenry, partly for military purposes, but also to construct a new nation state with comparative and competitive power in Europe. And other states rapidly imitated the Prussian example. At the same time, many educated individuals, politicians, began to travel very widely, and in some sense what one scholar calls a transatlantic policy community developed of both educational administrators and intellectuals looking at how other societies were developing new forms of, common forms of socializing children. You might want to say about some of the people that we refer to in the text.
Well, from the 19th century, I mean, we do refer to people like William Torrey Harris in the United States, like Victor Cousin in France. They were really statesmen looking to improve education. Then we move to the scholars, which is really the early 20th century. One of the most famous being Michael Sadler in England. Then we move on to looking at Nicholas Hans and Isaac Kandel. Both of them being immigrants. So Nicholas Hans emigrated from Russia to Britain. Isaac Kandel immigrated from Romania to England and then to the United States, studied with John Dewey, and then became really a great comparative education figure. Their discipline was mainly history. They really wanted to look at how different educational systems and ideas had developed in national contexts and to compare those. We also look at international organizations, the failure of the League of Nations to create an educational institution, but then the initiative of women who formed the League of New Education in the 1920s, and of figures like Jean Piaget, the first director of the International Bureau of Education in Geneva. So how much was done through the effort of individual thinkers in the first half of the 20th century? Then we move to the post-World War II period, where the whole infrastructure of international organizations took much clearer shape with the establishment of the United Nations. Maybe you want to comment on that, Karen?
After 1945, the world received both its first international organization devoted to education, UNESCO, which played a very major role in developing a set of common standards and norms about what schooling should be about, as well as the first form of financing for education in the developing world that wasn't uniquely a part of imperialism. Now, there's a lot of debate about the expansion of international organizations, both international non-governmental and governmental organizations, and their role in the development of educational systems in the South. I think in the first instance, these organizations promoted a view that schooling could be reformed and developed around a very scientific model of what was good and not good. And Ruth, you has a section on this in the first chapter.
Yeah, we begin the sort of second half, about the more or less contemporary period from the Second World War to the present, looking at three major paradigms. The first being the notion of comparative education as a science, which was a very exciting notion in the 50s and 60s. It was taken up by individuals like George Beraday, a Polish immigrant at Teachers College, Columbia, like Harold Noah and Max Eckstein, and very extensive ideas and thinkings linked to the work of sociologists and political scientists who were moving in the same direction, and economists, very much so. And the theories of human capital and notions about being able to discover the cause of educational achievement, and so the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. So we take that paradigm and then we look at all the responses to it. People like Edmund King at the University of London, who insisted that it's much more important to understand the subjective ideas of teachers and students in making educational policy than assume you can find a scientific set of prescriptions for education. People like Vandra Maceman, who's here at OISE, a very well-known anthropologist of education, again focusing very much on the subjective understanding. We also try to show that the debates were not limited to the North American or Western European or Western context. I indicate even a little bit earlier, the first comparative education textbook in China was written in 1931, a little bit before Kandel's book in the United States. It wasn't so well known, but the field was debated. And then we find scholars like Le Tan Coy, a Vietnamese scholar living in France, who developed a kind of civilizational approach to looking at education and society over long history. People like Guo Mingyuan, who had another take on comparative education from a Chinese perspective and having been educated in the Soviet Union.
These contrary or amplified perspectives on comparative education then met in the 70s with a huge rise of debate and critical theory about education itself, focused, I think, primarily on the question of whether schooling really produces progress and opportunity, or perhaps schooling produces inequality and is a form of systematized violence in its own right. Many of the scholars working along these lines drew from dependency and neocolonialist theory, world systems theory, theories about that tried to explain why it was that inequality in the world seemed to persist, and in some sense inequalities, despite the rise of wealth in some places, inequality overall did not seem to decrease. So these scholars were also then building on a very interesting literature from the sociology of education that had shown that, in fact, schools didn't do much to improve intergenerational mobility. All of this coming together in a kind of broader critique of both comparative education as science and a critique of comparative education that had focused on the nation state as the main unit of analysis, and began to say, well, perhaps we should understand schooling as a system that transcends the nation state and that plays some role in sorting life chances of children and adults around the world.
Another very important sort of thread that comes forth in the later part of the chapter is the contribution of feminist scholars. So we write about Gail Kelly, who really pioneered a great deal of comparative research on women's participation in education in different parts of the world. Her student Grace Mack, who did similar work in Asia. Nellie Stromquist with a more Latin American approach to show that when women scholars got into the field, they brought new thinking, new perspectives that fitted some of the old categories but also crossed categories in certain ways.
And in some sense, the feminists then became the critics of the world systems theorists and the neo-colonial theorists. They built on that. But I think, Ruth, you want to also introduce the concept of dialogue among civilizations, which in a sense is a more formative approach to comparative education, in the sense that it offers perhaps a more positive view of the opportunities that education systems themselves give for a global system that is more just and equitable.
Right. I think we're very much taken up with the pressures of globalization, the sort of pressures for conformity, the kinds of economic integration that is taking place, but maybe forgetting that with the end of the Cold War emerged a space for ideas from other civilizations. In the obsession with the sort of categories of socialist capitalists on the one hand, developed and developing on the other, we'd kind of forgotten about, the very different underpinnings of different societies. As a specialist on China, I'm very aware of Confucian ideas and culture. We also know there's rich legacies in the Middle Eastern thought, the Islamic world, in South Asia, in Africa, yes, in all parts of the world. And finally, there was a little bit of space. So I think the other side of globalization in terms of pressures for conformity has been a new awareness of the local and of the potential resources within different civilizations for addressing some of the questions and issues in education. And I've been very much engaged with that in terms of Confucianism as a response to the Enlightenment. That's one particular piece of that dialogue.
What can students expect to glean from this chapter?
I think that, first of all, the teacher reading it in the first instance is going to be very interested in the breadth and the depth of scholarship and the fact that our mass systems of education originated concurrently with efforts to compare across those systems. I mean, that almost nothing happened in any educational system that didn't happen in reference to another system. That, in fact, the education itself is just profoundly comparative. The whole enterprise began as a comparative enterprise. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that there are different motives for wanting to understand other educational systems, that those motives may have to do with improving the system, may have to do with better understanding the social, the cultural, the philosophical, the economic context of given countries, and trying to understand how schools fit into those systems and what difference they make to those systems is at the heart of comparative education. I think that comes out very clearly.
Yeah, and I would give it one more very simple purpose. I think it would enable teacher education students and new teachers to kind of have a handle, to know how to interpret the literature, to have a framework, yes, within which to recognize different approaches to education provided by this kind of historical overview of how the field of comparative education has developed.